Perfect.
Okay, excellent. All right. Thank you for being here today. It's only 1 o'clock my time because I'm on the West Coast, so it's not quite happy hour time for me yet. But it's also fun to see like a lot of familiar names and faces that I haven't seen since like probably this TSA meeting. So I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been involved in. This is the 6th year that I've been the scientific advisor for this community science-based ODNATA survey. And I would say not only is it cost effective, that it's low budget. So you're not going to be seeing any amazing, strange, never before seen species of dragon or damselflies here. These are all for us relatively common species, but part of what I've really enjoyed about this is kind of a lot of the different ways, the different impacts that this project has been having on a lot of the regional natural resource agencies and a lot of the staff that have actually gotten involved. And the fact that we have gotten new county records and we've seen some rare species that, you know, we just don't have flying through here very often. So I'm excited about community science. I've been doing community science one way or another probably for about 16 years, starting with master naturalists when I lived in Missouri. And I think it's, we can talk about the fact this is sort of coming on the heels of John talking about the Ode Olympics. And so, yeah, just kind of sharing some of the things we've learned, some of the lessons, some of the ways that this is done. And I hope it'll be useful to people. I should say not every slide is going to be duplicated. You're not going to be looking at all the slides twice. I do have both English and Spanish on the slides, but the title was simply too long to have in both languages on one slide. So I'm really pleased to see all the different language options and the closed captioning that they're making available. So I'm just going to jump right into it. This was done as a project. As I said, I was a scientific advisor, and this was done kind of the brainchild of a local watershed council, Johnson Creek Watershed Council. I don't know if every state has watershed councils, but these are, there are a lot of them all over Oregon. Just about every stream has one, even small ones, small streams, not small organizations. And they're state funded, and they do a lot of really great work from restoration, education and outreach, advocacy. And so there's a lot of different types of projects that they can do, and some of them do a fair bit of research. So Johnson Creek Watershed Council had been getting involved in community-based science for some years. They started off with people looking at salmon redds, the nests in the stream where the salmon lay their eggs. Salmon are a very big deal, of course, on the West Coast. It's what most stream restoration is actually targeted at, is improving salmon habitat. And they also had folks that were monitoring beaver dam and beaver dam activity. So I'd had a long association with the Watershed Council. I'd been a board member, and I was kind of pushing the idea of doing these dragonfly projects, kind of right around when I was coordinating the Migratory Dragonfly Partnership. And we're in our 6th-year monitoring now, so you can probably assume that it's been something of a success. But one of the things that was really a little bit of a mental stumbling block at first for the Watershed Council was that we needed this to cover the flight season of the odonates in our area. And that's not really June through October, it's more like April through November. So we had to kind of come up with a compromise that would let us have people out there with their eyes on the wetlands and on the streams during kind of peak activity for dragonflies and damselflies, without having sort of an utterly unwieldy number of months. And of course, they had to fit this in around a lot of the other things that they did normally as a watershed council anyway. But still, June through October is a pretty substantial period of time to be having volunteers going out. And we aim to have them visit each one of the different sites. There are 3 sites that have been being monitored during this time. We aim to have teams go out and visit hopefully at least once every 2 weeks. Now, of course, those timings get moved around a little bit. Sometimes the weather isn't right. Sometimes somebody has a schedule thing pop up, and so the team has to reorganize itself. But this is a pretty long span of time. This is a long season to be getting people to go out there, you know, again and again and again in hot weather, in conditions that can be a little challenging to move around in. But people have really embraced it enthusiastically, and it's become a very strong part, actually, of some of the science and research that the Watershed Council talks about. So as I said, we have 3 sites in Portland. So this is a very zoomed out map. It does not show all of Portland. It shows the east side. So that large river that you see at the left-hand side of the screen, on the west side there is the Willamette River, runs up north, just about where it dumps into the Columbia River there. And there are 3 dots on that. So the one that you see on the left-hand side, Westmoreland Park, that's our westernmost site. You can see it's in a very heavily developed, urbanized area. Brookside wetlands in the middle, still surrounded by a lot of urban development. And then off in the east, the easternmost site called Centennial Pond, still surrounded by a lot of development, but there's still a bit more agricultural activity out here, although it too is in an area that is rapidly growing. So with Westmoreland Park, this is a site that I live pretty close to. And I noticed that soon after a restoration project was done in 2014, 2015-ish, that the odonate population really increased. I used to go there and very sadly wander around hoping that I would find dragonflies, and then I would wander home again with my shoulders slumped. And then after they did this restoration project, I'm seeing dragonflies all over the place. And so I thought, this is a really good site that we should have a lot more people looking at. Brookside is a fairly unmodified site as far as just physical habitat is concerned. It was established some years ago as a stormwater retention site and a flood management site for that part of the city, for Johnson Creek. And then Centennial Pond, we were able to get 2 years of pre-restoration baseline data on the odonate populations there before a large restoration project went in 2019. We were able to monitor, so both pre and post restoration, which is always the goal if you can manage it. So how does this work? The Watershed Council is a very large volunteer base, and they're very, very good at communicating with them. They've got hundreds and hundreds of people that turn out to various different events that they run pretty much all year here. So using their volunteer base, and they do all the different recruitment, we generally are able to start off with anywhere from, I'd say 15 to 20, 25-ish people in each one of the years of monitoring. And since we have started, we also generally have anywhere from 3 to 6 people that are returning monitors. So they took the training in the past and maybe they haven't done the monitoring every single year, but we have people that are sticking around for a good period of time. So we start off in the classroom, we have a half day. Many of these people have absolutely no experience with odonates. One of the reasons that they oftentimes say that they're joining the project is because they want to learn about dragonflies and damselflies. And we have had a couple of different people who are kind of local fixtures in the sort of insect or dragonfly community who come in with a lot of good experience. And that's been fantastic. But a lot of these people were starting them out from ground zero. So the classroom training includes the basics of odonate natural history and life history. We want to make sure that they know what the life cycle is so that they are able to recognize various different behaviors that they're going to be asked to record. And of course, we go through the identification. And I only concentrate for that on the species that are currently on the list from Odonata Central for Multnomah County, the county that all these different sites are located in. I always tell people, chance favors the prepared mind, right? Keep your eyes out for what doesn't look quite like what you're used to seeing. Might not know what it is, but you're gonna know that you've seen something different. And that's actually borne out a couple of new species sightings since this project began. But I don't want to overwhelm people with all the different mosaic darners and all the different forktails and all the different dancers. We only really see one dancer, for example, in our area. So we focus on those species. And of course, identification is always what volunteers are most terrified about, right? They're scared they're going to get it wrong. They're a little bit intimidated to learn it. And so we also make sure that we then follow this up very quickly on the same day with a session in the field at one of our field sites. Sometimes that doesn't work out so well. In the middle of one of the biggest droughts that we have had in this area for several months, it of course chose to be a downpour on the afternoon that we had field training. So I had to schedule an alternative day. Sometimes that happens, but ideally we get out there, we get people to practice using the nets, getting these insects in hand, getting them hands-on experience on how to handle them, how to get them in the net, how to get them out of the net, and how to identify males versus females, show them what some of those different things are up close and personal that they've only ever seen on the slides that far. This is a lot of information to give them, so it is of course accompanied by a protocol manual that I put together that has become more and more detailed as the years have gone by, as we have seen some things that volunteers find a little bit challenging and know that we need to address in a little bit more detail. And as we've gotten feedback from the volunteers themselves about what they wish they had in hand, or what they wish they had a little bit more information on. And then I said the volunteers will go out in teams, usually of 2 to 4 people. We don't want anybody going out alone. And they report their data. I'll talk about how that works in just a few minutes. But then as a quality assurance mechanism, I try to do one survey every month at each one of these different sites during that June through October season. And that way I can compare what I'm seeing when I go out there with what the volunteers are reporting. I can get an idea of if they're missing anything, or if maybe a species shows up that they might not notice necessarily to differentiate. You know, if I see a nobo, a northern arboreal bluet, they might just think, oh, that's another Thule bluet. I can send out an email saying, hey, you folks out of Brookside, I was seeing some of these nobos, you might want to keep an eye on them, take a second look, you know, get some more photos. So we've got this kind of quality control that is built in as well. And one of the volunteers, I should say, when they're heading out into the field, they are able to check out nets and hand lenses, and also handy dandy copies, of course, of the dragonflies and damselflies of Oregon. This is the Bible that we keep in hand. I let them know about Dennis Paulson's book, The Dragonflies of the West, but I like to keep it a little bit more narrowed in so they don't get terribly confused by a lot of different species that they won't necessarily see. So they've got some various different resources as they head out in the field, and I'm also always available to answer their questions. So what do we ask them to look for when they go out to these sites? They receive maps before they go out. You know, each one of the different sites has kind of a defined transect that they will walk. They're looking over the open water. They're looking in the vegetation as well. We have kind of the water and the upland area that we want to cover. So we ask them to note and record if they see males and or females, and if they see maybe a tenorol or they just don't know. Sometimes on the skimmers, they can find it a little bit more difficult to tell what sex it is. They can put down unknown as well. So any combination of what they see. If they see any tenorol adults, we want to get an idea of not just do we have, for example, males patrolling at these sites, but do we have egg to adult development? And, you know, the discussion comes up occasionally. There are always some folks that get excited about nymphs. If they see exuvia, oh, you know, can we collect and identify exuvia? That's great. It's a great way to be sure that you're seeing, you know, something that emerged at the site, to know that they're actually successfully going from egg to adult, but it's a kind of an additional level of complexity that we have been unwilling to move into, even with Ken Tennyson's new guide out. So we figure, you know, if you're seeing these tenorol adults, these newly emerged adults, there's a very good chance that if they didn't emerge right directly at that site, they emerged very nearby. So we get an idea of the quality of the site for breeding and for survival to adulthood as well. We ask them to notice any mating behaviors, if they see any creatures in the wheel, if they see any tandem pairs flying around, and do they see any egg-laying behavior. And I should say that all of the photos that I used for this presentation, some of them are mine, and those are photos that I took at the different sites during my own QA surveys. But any other ones were taken from the survey reports themselves. So these are all photographs that were captured and submitted as part of the records by the volunteer teams that were going out. And then when it came to counting numbers, kind of thinking about what the goals of the project were, you know, looking at patterns of seasonality, overall community composition. And I decided that it wasn't necessarily all that important that we know exactly precisely what the number of individuals of any different species was. Because frankly, when you're walking along and you've got clouds of Ischnura cervula, Pacific forktail, which is one of the most abundant species we have, flying up from your feet, you're gonna double count them, and you're not gonna get an accurate count anyway. So we settled instead on reporting abundance categories. And so you can see that they range anywhere from uncommon to frequent to common to abundant, which is kind of at the way more than I am able to count category. And that's been pretty reliable. It allows a little bit of a buffer. If there is a little bit of double counting, well, if you saw 12 and you recorded it as 16, it's still going to fall into the same abundance category. We do tell people how to move through their transect to try to avoid doing that double counting, but these abundance categories have really been sufficient for us to get an idea of, you know, how the populations are kind of changing from year to year and from month to month. And it just makes it a little bit simpler on the volunteers to do their reporting. We also decided early on that we would use an iNaturalist platform in order for people to upload their data and to have this be sort of a permanent record of the project. For a lot of smaller organizations like this Watershed Council, having the staff time to actively manage a server that this would land on and having that be able to continue over a long time. I mean, there's no guarantees written in stone that iNaturalist will always be around, but it's got a pretty good track record. And also, we all, the Watershed Council and myself, all kind of like the idea that these data would be freely available. So there are local projects like the Portland-Vancouver BioBlitz, which is an ongoing thing. And we'll see our records immediately pulled into some of these local projects as well. And I've just simply gotten into the habit, if I'm looking at, is something a new county record? Has it ever been seen here? An early date, a late date? Yes, I could debate with you about all the different problems with iNaturalist and with people declaring identifications that are totally wrong. And that does happen, but it's also a freely accessible platform. And a lot of people, I know even in the ODNA community, have actually gotten some valuable data, valuable information and specimen records and species records going and looking at these freely available iNaturalists. So you can see kind of the stats for the project. This is actually already out of date because I did a QA survey a couple of days ago at one of the parks. We have over 1,000 different observations, so 1,000 different species records, 32 species total, and that might not sound terribly impressive, but it's almost 3/4 of what is the current number of species listed for this county in Odanada Central. And this is in highly urbanized parts of the city of Portland, which is not a tiny city. So I think that's pretty respectable. The number of people that's shown there, that is not the number of people total that have been involved in the project. It's the number of people that have done the reporting. So when every team goes out and does a survey at a site, they have a designated reporter. So they know as soon as they disperse and go back to their homes that one person is going to have the responsibility of entering the records that they got during that survey. So of course my name is on top for most observations because I'm the one doing all the QA surveys. But 2 of the 4 names below are people that are Watershed Council staff. And Daniel Newberry is actually the executive director of the Watershed Council. And they've gotten very into this and they've learned a lot about it and they're doing it on their own. And 2 of those other names, those are folks that started off, I think, with pretty much no dragonfly experience that became very much enthusiast. And Phil, the second name on the list, Phil Nosler, he started off, I think he was 16. He had to get his father's permission to be able to join the project. He turned into one of those super volunteers that everybody dreams about. Great identification skills, really good hand with a net, got some of our new species records, and he dropped out of the project because he's now at University of Oregon and he wants to study millipedes for his life's work, which, you know, it's not quite insects, but it's still pretty cool. And then the other person, Bonnie, she has actually become a fairly avid poster on the Western Odanada Facebook page. So we've gotten a few more souls lost to dragonflies in this process. And then below that, so this is what you see is just, if you're familiar with using iNaturalist, this is just the standard data screen. So iNaturalist was just set up to report whatever your species is, wherever you saw it on a particular date. And if you have photos or sound files, you can upload them, right? And the nice thing about this, kind of similar to Odanada Central, is you can start typing in either a common name or the species name, and you will get the pull down menu. So once again, it avoids those spelling errors that can be a problem when you're trying to work with data. There's a notes field. So if there's anything, you know, major that's changed about the habitat or anything that you feel that you know, somebody would need to know about the project, you can put it there. But then you can also customize these iNaturalist project pages. So if you scroll down that same page, all of those different categories, these are an exact mirror of the data sheets that the volunteers have. So the names of all the observers, everybody on the team is reported. That way, if I have a question about a record, I know who to go back to. We know the start and the end time. That also allows the Watershed Council to capture volunteer hours, which is a monetary match for them on their grants. The average temperature from when they were there was the wind, and this turns into a drop down: calm, light, moderate, or strong. Estimation of what the cloud cover was, again, any individual notes, you know, lone, male, patrolling, for example. And then the gender, male, female, unknown. How did they do the identification? Did they just look at it? Was it just visual? Did they capture it and get it in hand? Did they take a photograph? So any combination of those is put down. Those abundance categories, the frequent, common, uncommon, abundant, those are all mirrored there as well. And then any of what we've called reproductive stages. So that's individuals in wheel, tandem pairs, teneral adults, or oviposition. All of those are captured there. So that's put in for every individual species that they saw at a site on their monitoring day. So just kind of briefly run through, I think we're going a little long here already. Westmoreland Park, that was the westernmost site, that we have. It's a small stream that runs through this park called Crystal Springs Creek, perennial spring-fed, nice cool water. And it used to have a very, very large inline pond. The green thing that you see on the screen there is not the inline pond. It is a casting pond that is off the creek that really does have water that color. And it's apparently beloved by the neighborhood, and they were up in arms when they said they were going to remove it. So the casting pond is still there. The inline pond that heated up the creek and captured a lot of sediment is gone. But when they took out that pond and remeandered the stream, they reconnected it with the floodplain. And so somewhat unexpectedly, they also created a whole lot of new wetlands. So that was done in 2015. And I said, I noticed right away there were a lot more different kinds of dragonflies there. But as with many restoration projects, invasive species moved in. So there are a lot of nutria as well as beaver and otter in the area, and nutria really destabilized stream banks. And so we were starting to see after a few years banks that were sloughing off into the creek. A lot of invasive plants like teasel and reed canary grass and Himalayan blackberry, 3 very common invasive plant species in our riparian areas. Those were really increasing. The stream was beginning to be choked out by vegetation. The open water that was there in the wetlands was beginning to be covered by vegetation. And we were seeing changes in the abundance and the diversity of dragonflies throughout these years of monitoring as the quality of the habitat changed. And some of that information was actually brought back to the Portland Parks and Recreation that managed this park, and it was included as kind of an impetus for them to think about how they were doing their management. So this is just showing you on the upper left what that brand new remeander looked like, very naked and bare, of course. Log structures were put in to kind of slow the flow, create some pool habitat. On the right, you see kind of the new and improved stream. And then on the lower left, you can see where that vegetation is really taking over everything. That water that you see there is not the wetland, it's the creek. And then we've had a situation here where we've had several years in a row of much drier than usual weather. You might have heard about the wonderful heat dome that we had, 115 degrees in Portland. It was just delightful in the month of June. And that's what the biggest wetland at the park looked like well before the heat dome, because we also had a lot less precipitation this spring than we should have. So we're seeing local changes in the habitat. And we're also seeing larger climate-induced changes in the habitat, and we're seeing changes in the odonate population. So changes in diversity and abundance with changes in habitat and weather. So this is just showing the total number of species seen in each month at this park in all the different survey years. And the years where the habitat quality was the highest and where our temperature and precipitation was somewhat more normal for our area, that's the blue and the green diamonds there. You can see that we had somewhat higher numbers of species in those different months, and that they dropped, especially in 2018 when the habitat was getting really, really overgrown and the stream was getting choked and the open water was being overgrown and wasn't really available. That recovered a little bit in 2019 with some improved habitat management. 2020 was a special year. Of course, we couldn't send out volunteer teams with COVID. So the Watershed Council staff took on 2 of the sites. I took on the 3rd one. We still tried to have regular monitoring. We didn't want to lose a year of data. You can also see that that ends in August. As you might remember or not, come August of last year, just to make it even more special and memorable, we had a gigantic windstorm that sparked and spread a whole bunch of additional fires that we really didn't need. It was a terrible fire year here. And then the wildfires came. So I lived a mile away from one of the closest to me evacuation zones. And I spent part of August running around my house, filming my belongings and packing up bags to be able to bug out if we needed to, which luckily we did not. But we had at least a week of having to be indoors with the windows closed. The sky was orange, there was no sunlight because the smoke from the wildfires was so bad. And the conditions after that going into September were still not super. And so surveys got a little bit truncated. But if you take a look at just kind of community similarities, and because I've got those abundance categories, I have to do this as just presence or absence of a species in any month or year. You can see that, there's a difference in the community composition in those earlier years, immediately post-restoration, 2016 and 2017, between the later years, and that the community has been changing more and more over time. Some species that were really abundant there are a lot less normal now. So we used to see a lot of western pond hawk and blue dasher and 12-spotted skimmers. And those are much more rare sightings now with the way the habitat has changed. Yes, admittedly, these are very common, widespread species, not so common and widespread anymore at Westmoreland Park, although they are at other spots in the area. Centennial, which is the easternmost spot, this is the one that you can see. There is some residential development around it, and that's actually expanding, but there's still a lot of farmland around it. And I've zoomed out a little bit here so you can sort of see that patchwork of surrounding land use, but it's really sort of an isolated site. It's visited a lot more frequently by coyotes than it is by human beings. You got to walk about a half mile into it. And you can see also that the center of the page there where the dot is, that there's kind of an oval around it. So the previous owner of this property, before the school district acquired it, had built not only a large inline pond, which was really heating up the water that was moving through the creek, a little creek called Mitchell Creek. They'd also built a racetrack, like a dirt racetrack for some reason, which was strange. You can still see that there. So the restoration project that was done here in 2019 was to get rid of that pond, to restore the flow of the creek, lower the water temperature in the area. This was also an area that was really overgrown with Himalayan black bear. You needed your machete if you were going to go to that site. And so they were also replanting with native plants. So again, you kind of see the progression here from pond to naked new stream bed. The water's released back into it. Nice little small creek now with some vegetation and some nice large boulders. And although the number of species crashed in 2019 when the restoration was being done, they rebounded amazingly. So you can see that immediately in like a month to a month and a half post-restoration in 2019, there were more species observed than ever before at that site. And as always, the composition of those species had changed from a lot of just sort of open water skimmers. Vivid dancers, Argia vivida, decided they really like this site. They're the most abundant damselfly that there is, which is a little bit unusual for some of our wetland sites that usually have a lot more Pacific forktails and tule bluets. And again, you can see, you know, the relationship between the community, the species composition in different years. 2019 is really an outlier because of that perturbation of restoration in a different community in 2020 compared to the pre-restoration years. And then Brookside, the one that's kind of in the center, this is off of Johnson Creek. And this was established many years ago as a stormwater and flood mitigation site. And so physically speaking, there has not been that, you know, in-channel work, digging, replanting, restoration work that the other two sites have seen. Again, you can see that there's a major road close to it. There's a dense residential, and also it's a mixed light industrial area. So this is a very heavily impacted site. Houseless community, there tends to be a lot of folks that are camped out there as well, because again, it's a little bit more quiet. It's easy to forget that there are houses around, and so folks don't get harassed there. But what does vary here a lot is water levels, because beavers like to move into the creek that's just on the other side of that pond. And in the years when the dams are active, that pond could be nice and full of water and vegetation the way it is there. And in wintertime, when some of the beaver dams blow out, we have years when the water levels are lower, and that actually separates into two different ponds with sort of a muddy little berm in between them. So physical habitat itself, not that different, but water levels can be. This site has generally been the one with the highest diversity across time. I think especially in our hot, dry summers, that open water is just a magnet for the different species in the site. And there's not as much, it's a little bit less disturbed site as far as intensity of usage, even with the houseless folks that wander around in there. So it's been a bit of a magnet as well, sometimes for some of the rarer species that we've seen. And it might be because of those different water levels. So this is where we have our one and only sighting of a spot-winged glider, our one and only sighting of a lance-tip darner. But it is interesting that there are a lot of fish at this site, and there are bullfrogs, another invasive species that breeds around here. Of all three of the sites, this is the one that is probably more of a habitat sink, where the odonates think it's good habitat. They go in. We do see egg laying in there. We do see mating. We don't see that many teneral adults. And so it may be that more of the individuals that are breeding here, the eggs and or the nymphs are being consumed by the fish, by the bullfrog. So it may not be quite as good a habitat from that point of view. So what have we found overall here? As I said, the number of species seen among all the sites in every year is almost 3/4 of the county list. That's not too shabby. don't generally tend to see more than 12 to maybe 14 species per day at any one site. So there is a, kind of a limited subset that's present at any one of the sites. Most of the breeding and emerging behavior that we see is happening at Westmoreland and to a lesser extent at Brookside. We see a lot of patrolling males at Brookside and Centennial, but less mating and oviposition being observed there. And, if some of this is just random chance, right? You're in the right place at the right time. But, if people are in the right place at the right time at Westmoreland to see wheel formation and oviposition, hypothetically, they should be as well at Brookside and Centennial. So those may be more attractive for males, thinking that it's good habitat to patrol, not quite as attractive for the females. This is especially true of the dragonflies. We tend to see a lot more healthy, reproducing damselfly populations for about the 4 or 5 different damsel species that we see, even at Brookside and Centennial. Not as much, though, of the reproductive behavior among the dragonflies. We got 4 of the 5 migratory species in North America that are using that habitat. The only one we haven't seen at all is the wandering glider, but one of them is very rare. We've only seen the spot-winged one time on one date. Only 2 of them seem to be showing successful breeding and emergence behavior. So we do see black saddlebags. I think maybe once or twice we've seen a pair in wheel. Mostly it's the occasional patrolling male. And common green darner and variegated meadowhawk are the ones that we see the teneral adults. We see early migrants arriving from the south. We see migrants that are individuals that will presumably be migrants that are emerging later in the summer that will fly away. We see teneral adults also in the middle of the year. Those are probably the residents. So got some migratory habitat support that is going on here as well. But as I said, with the increasing drought, the increasing wildfires, it used to be that on a hot day here, we only had a couple of hot days in a row. Now we have strings of them. We're having them earlier and earlier. We're having drier winters and springs. Our wildfire activity is frighteningly elevated. Air quality and particulate matter, who knows what effect that's having on flight and dispersal. So there's a lot of different things that are going on, and we're seeing changes in the communities, as I said, in diversity and in abundance. But it's hard to piece out at this point how much of that is, hopefully we won't get a heat dome every year. So whatever those perturbations are to the community, those should hopefully rebound from that. But the drier, hotter weather, these hot, dry winds that we seem to get every time we get temperatures that are in the upper 80s or 90s, that seems like it's here to stay. So some of these community shifts may be a little bit more permanent. So we had new species for the county. And again, this isn't a highly urbanized area. Would you really expect to have new county records here? Maybe not, but we have. When we started this project in 2016, the official Odenata Central County list was 39 species. I personally doubt that Cynipteryx hagenii was ever here, but still, it's listed, so that's 39 species. And now we have 44 species. And this project was not responsible for all of those species additions, but we had, photo vouchered georeference records for autumn meadowhawks and Petrum vicinum, that was at Westmoreland Park, and black meadowhawk, which is not something you would expect to see in these lowland urban wetlands. And by a funny coincidence, because that record was uploaded on iNaturalist and it was publicly available, on the same day that one of our volunteers, Phil, the high school student, saw that black meadowhawk, Dennis Paulson saw some up in Seattle at a park that he goes to regularly. So they were all over in that lowland area, or at least pretty widely dispersed. We've had some records that are very rare for the county. Some of them did not have photo vouchered records. Some of them, if you look on Odenata Central, there's only a couple of other records besides these. So I mentioned spot-wing glider and lance-tip darner. River jewelwing that we found at Westmoreland Park, just kind of hanging out in some shady vegetation, and four-spotted skimmer as well. Again, these are not things that we see every year. They're occasional sightings, but they've added to what we know about the community in this county. Of course, some of the common widespread species are very persistent, very consistently found. 8 species at this point have been found at every single site, at least sometime in every single year. So common green darner, cardinal meadowhawk, 8-spotted skimmer, common whitetail, blue-eyed darners are super urban lovers. They are at all these different sites in pretty high abundance. Pacific and western forktails and tule bluets are also found at all of our different sites. And range expansions. So flame skimmer, Libellula saturata. This is something that for a while people thought, yeah, it seems like it's really expanding its distribution to the north. And if you look at a couple of the dots in Portland, I don't think I've got like pointer. I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but the one red dot that's right above the name, the city of Portland, that was Jim Johnson at a super, super, super urban in the heart of downtown park called Tanner Creek Springs. And the same year that he found Lobelia saturata there, our volunteers found it in the dot that's just to the lower right of that one. That's Westmoreland Park. And at the time, those were the northernmost sightings for that species in this state. And then Jim started looking for it even harder. There was an article that he wrote about this for RG a couple of years ago, so you may have read it. And he started hunting for it mighty hard in Washington, and sure enough, it turned up. But we're seeing, because of this regular monitoring, at this point now, we only saw one that year when it was the northernmost end of the range. It's at the point now where if we were not to see it at any one of our sites in a particular year, I would get kind of suspicious and wonder what's going on, because it's become a pretty common inhabitant of the local wetlands where it wasn't really here before. So to kind of finish up quickly here with kind of lessons learned, what are some of the things we've done that have helped keep this program running? It's to know what the volunteers want, right? They need to get something out of this. They're giving us their time. So we always do a survey. We solicit a lot of feedback, and the Watershed Council does this just routinely for all the different volunteers in all their programs. So one of the first things they said they wanted was more social interaction with each other and more independence to organize their own surveys. So when this started out, everything was funneled through the Watershed Council employee, and it was a lot of work for that person, and it got very cumbersome. So now we've set up what the council calls this Dragonfly toolkit. And I know that's a little small print there, but it's a Google Sheets thing, and so there's different tabs. So for the schedule, people can just access it, sign up for the days and places they want to survey and the dates that are already on there. People can sign up to be a substitute or a backup surveyor. So if somebody can't make it, they can just look at the name of the backup, go to the contact information page, and text or email that person. And then there's a checklist for all the different things that everybody should have heading out into the field. A little table that I put together of what are the temperature and wind and cloud conditions when you should or should not go out and do your surveys. So they've got that as a resource. They want to know if the data is being used for something. They want to know what was found. They want to have an idea of what the big picture is, and they're interested to know, how is this being used by the Watershed Council, by Portland Parks and Recreation, by Portland Metro, and the data are being used by those organizations. And then with people coming back year after year and folks who are new to project and new to Dragonfly ID being very tentative and worried that they're getting it right, we developed this idea of peer mentors. So every year we identify people that are returning volunteers, and we try to make sure that for at least the first month or two of surveys, every team that has a new person on it also has one of these peer mentors that can help provide a little bit of support, help with the identification, and help with the protocol. And that's been very much appreciated, it seems, based on the feedback that we've gotten from people. They also said they needed a few additional resources that they didn't have. One person mentioned that she was always having to just flip through the field guide to try to find something that looked similar. She wanted some way to quickly tell what family the individual she was looking at was in. So I put together just kind of a quick and dirty guide to families so that they can say, oh, I'm looking at a spread wing, I go right to that section of the book. I'm looking at a skimmer, I go right to that section of the book. And the other thing I've learned is a bad photo. I can't believe I'm saying this, but even a bad photo is better than no photo. And I will admit that during the City Nature Challenge, I was one of the people who got on Facebook and I was bitching about the fact that, yeah, that thing that I was trying to identify for somebody, it might have been a yellow-faced bumblebee, but it might have been a rapidly vibrating Cheerio. I really couldn't tell from the photo. But as bad, for example, as blurry and low quality as the picture of that jewel wing is on the lower right, it is still very identifiable to species. And with the spot wing glider, it's not a bad photo necessarily, but it's not a great angle. But the thing is, the team that was out there that day knew they had not previously seen anything that looked like it. And bless their hearts, instead of shrugging it off and saying unknown skimmer, they followed it, and they never managed to get a net on it, but they got a picture that allowed it to be identified to species. So we so much encourage people to take photos. We also try to give them really good guidance on what parts of the insect to photograph. I can always tell when somebody really internalized the lesson about mosaic darners and blue spots on the top of the abdomen and blue spots on the bottom of the abdomen, but then they translated that into taking a bluet and taking a lot of photos of the underside of the abdomen that are really not terribly helpful for identification. So we try to not only encourage photos, but what parts of the insect to photograph, depending on if it's a dragon or a damselfly, to be able to get to that ID. And one of the things I think is really cool is that we have had as participating volunteers people from natural resource agencies from different cities, like City of Portland and City of Gresham, which is a nearby city. They've participated as volunteers and or taken the training because they want to start their own monitoring programs. So we have a new start this year with people with one of the different city organizations that are looking at dragonflies as well as amphibians using stormwater wetlands, trying to incorporate the needs of dragonflies and damselflies, taking them into account up front when they're developing their restoration projects. And I get asked a lot of questions about that. So I think it's just really wonderful that in the last 5 years, a lot of different people that I know, work for these organizations, they want to identify these things. They want to figure out how to improve their sites so that they can better support these dragonfly populations. And I think that's a super use of community-based data. So I know that there is a lot of debate, I won't say argument, strong opinion on the validity of data gathered by these community-based programs, but long-term monitoring is critical, I think. And one-offs, we know that populations vary. We know they can be impacted in the short term by what was the weather like that year, or is it a longer weather pattern? Is this a total change in climate? By these variations in habitat, whether it's restoration or a site getting overgrown or vegetation management being done. And so being able to do something over 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years, that's well beyond the capabilities of most organizations. Maybe if you're in academia and you've got that as your research program, but if you've got a small budget and you've got to rely on volunteers, this is a way to collect data that's usable data. Do I have records that I have to throw out every year? Absolutely I do. Sometimes the photos just can't actually be identified. And sometimes it's a record and you think, well, it's plausible that that particular species might be there, but it's not totally likely at this time of year. And in the absence of a record, of a photo record, I just can't accept it. So sure, I have to toss out some records every year, but not the majority of them. And so I feel that there is a great deal of value to this, just as far as what we're learning about dragonfly and damselfly communities in our area. And it's also been a tremendous outreach opportunity for the Watershed Council. They talk about this during their annual science symposiums that they have. They post photos of these, of the dragonflies and of the volunteers on Instagram and on Facebook. They've incorporated this into what they talk about and into what they teach. And as I mentioned, the data is being used in effectiveness monitoring and habitat management. It's being used to say, look, you used to have great dragonfly populations here. The diversity is down. We think it's linked to this change in vegetation management. Can you do a little different kind of management? Or people saying, well, what do I need to do during this project to make sure I do have good habitat for dragonfly and damselfly populations? And it might not be the most important part of it, but some of the volunteers are using this project as part of their career path. I get folks that are undergraduate students that are doing this to learn more about insects and also to have it be something that they can put on their resume as some kind of experience. People like that high school student, Phil, who got so excited and so involved in this and participated in other BioBlitzes as well in the area. And now he wants his career to be this. He's studying invertebrates in college now. And we've even sucked a few more people into areas like, Odonata Central. I'm hoping we see some new faces at DSA meetings because of this. So there's more that I could say, but I'm at the end of my time. So I just want to acknowledge Johnson Creek Watershed Council providing all the funding for this. The managers of some of these different sites, which is Portland Parks and Recreation, Portland Bureau of Environmental Services, and obviously those dozens and dozens and dozens of volunteers out there. So that is what I have. And I think the plan now is that folks can ask questions. If you've been hanging on to them, you can ask them now, put them in the chat. Amanda will send those on to me. I think you'll even be able to unmute yourself and I can spend some time chatting with you.